is titled Age of the Strongman, The Rise and Rise of Illiberal Democracies. Please welcome on stage Ms. Nirupama Rao, former Foreign Secretary, Mr. N. Ravi, publisher, The Hindu Group of Newspapers, Ms. Maria Abi-Habib, South Asia Correspondent, New York Times, and Mr. Max Rodenbeck, South Asia Bureau Chief, The Economist. Please also welcome on stage Ms. Suhasini Haidar, Diplomatic Editor, The Hindu, who will moderate this discussion. Over to you, Suhasini.
Hello and welcome back, everybody. We're discussing the age of strong men, and I know the first reaction is going to be, well, what about the women? And I will get to that. But the age of strong men is really about the times we live in. Leaders, and these are primarily men, I'm going literally by statistics, who are being elected worldwide, who believe in muscular policies. In fact, in 2018, one study that was published in The Atlantic found that when they looked across the world, there were actually 46 such leaders across 33 countries that had been elected since 1990. But the bulk of those had happened in the last 15 years, not in the last 30 years. What defines strongmen? What defines what we call the age of populism, if you like? There are several very specific definitions, so it's not a relative term. They come to power on certain planks. Those planks are anti-elite, and as a result, anti-corruption. That's certainly one of the planks that they are on. Many of them, in fact, most of them, are anti-pluralistic, which means they believe in one majoritarian strain that eventually helps them win that election. They look at military pitches, a pitch to stronger militaries, a stronger role for their militaries. They use foreign policy very much for domestic ends. And we have a former foreign secretary here who's going to address just that. And a majority that were elected in these last 15 years, the studies now say, we are seeing the effects of those in the 2020s. So the question is, are strongmen here to stay? Is this the alpha century or just an alpha decade? Because what we're talking about is democracies. We're not talking about dictatorships, military rule, and other such autocratic or one-party rule like we have in China. Or other such systems. We're talking about what is happening with democracies around the world. And remember, the leaders of the world's four most populous democracies are India, the United States, Brazil, and the Philippines. And each of those leaders, you will see, have a certain link to some of the qualities that I just spoke about. Anti-elitism, anti-pluralism, military strength, foreign policy as a domestic tool. If I could come to you, Max, to start with. In 24 hours from now, in fact, literally in 24 hours from now, we will see two of those leaders, Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi, stand side by side and address what seems like a political rally, which is fairly unprecedented, would you say? Would you agree that this is, in fact, the age of strongmen?
Very much so. But I mean, I'm not so sure. I mean, if one looks into the actual conditions by which each one of these strongmen came into power, I mean, there does seem to be a global wave, but I mean, I think there's certain kind of attributes and circumstances that make it possible. And it's in some ways just a coincidence that this has happened in different countries. I mean, I think we often look maybe too much at the personalities of strongmen and not enough at the conditions that made their arrival possible. And I think that's where it gets quite interesting, because you find that the conditions are rather similar. I mean, one can sort of mention in virtually all these cases, there's a particular historical moment in that particular country where there's a sort of vacuum that's been created that's just waiting to be exploited. There's a situation waiting to be exploited. I mean, there's a public anger that's arisen, waiting to be exploited. There's a kind of ideological exhaustion waiting to be exploited by someone. There's sort of technological change waiting to be exploited. And in each of these places, you'll find that someone someone rises up to do that. And I think also that there's the particular advantages that these individuals have. Trump, Modi, Berlusconi in Italy, Erdogan in Turkey, Putin in Russia. All of them have had a particular character traits that might be described as the sort of the populist kind of manual. I mean, there's a certain ruthlessness and ambition, obviously, but also it helps to have certain friends who've been behind you, a certain base that's particularly useful. And I think all of these people also have they have a certain actor's ability. You need to be able to channel this anger, to capture the anger and channel it back in a way that's kind of believable. So I think they certainly both have that. And you also have to kind of look. The French have a great word which is présidentiable. Does someone look présidentiable? Does he look like someone who can be a president? So you have to act out this role and make it happen. And then there's a final thing, which is of course luck. I mean, these are all rather lucky people. As Napoleon said, you'd rather have a general that was lucky than one that was competent. Luck plays a big role. But I think when you have this great pageant, I mean, these are two people, Trump and Modi right now, they're reveling in their role. And it's just kind of returning the favor. I mean, having had Howdy Modi in Texas, here we are, showing that we can do or outdo, hopefully, we shall see, the kind of pageantry that Modi enjoyed in Texas. So it's just a sort of celebration of their being on top of things, I suppose.
Although, as some have pointed out, in both cases, it seems the Indian taxpayer that's picking up a lot of the bill, both in Houston and in Ahmedabad. Nirupama Rao, you have been Foreign Secretary. You also served in South America, where you saw both right-wing populism as well as left-wing populism. And we've seen them take turns almost over there. Is there a pattern you see to the kind of foreign policy these leaders are now bringing to the world? They're changing the paradigms. They're changing the way foreign policy is done. They're tweeting directly to each other. Thank you for the quote. Thank you for this. I look forward to coming to your country before even the diplomats have gotten there. So is there a pattern to how they've changed foreign policy?
You're talking about South America. I lived there in the mid-90s. It was before the age of Twitter, and social media hadn't, made its appearance over the horizon. It was a time when President Fujimori was in power in Peru. And when you talk of his popularity, it was at the zenith because he had dealt with terrorism. He had seen the end of the Sendero Luminoso. And more importantly, when the Japanese embassy was attacked and besieged by the Tupac Amaru, another terror group, I happened to be there at the embassy, just left 2 minutes before the attack. The siege lasted for 4 months, and Fujimori managed to free the hostages, and it was an extremely successful operation. So you can see when strongmen, leaders like that, are seen to be dealing decisively with muscularity, with assertiveness, there is a resounding upsurge of even more popularity that they enjoy as a result of those actions. But that was in the 90s, and you know what happened to Fujimori. He is now in prison, he's incarcerated. And that phase is over, I think, as far as Peru is concerned. But I was thinking about, the rise of strongmen, and the phrase illiberal democracy was used in the title for this session. And many of us do not remember this very fundamental essay by Fareed Zakaria in Foreign Affairs in 1997, when he first used the phrase illiberal democracy. And what exactly does illiberal democracy mean? And I'd like here to quote about democracy and the late Samuel Huntington, what he had to say. And he said that, let me just get that quote, elections open, free and fair are the essence of democracy, the inescapable sine qua non. Governments produced by elections may be inefficient, corrupt, short-sighted, irresponsible, dominated by special interests, and incapable of adopting policies demanded by the public good. These qualities make such governments undesirable, but they do not make them undemocratic. So you see the quandary that many of us are faced with here. I think where illiberal democracy, if there is a phrase that is sustainable like that, I think it really means that constitutional liberalism is not given the importance that it deserves. We have a wonderful constitution in this country. It's not given the importance that it deserves, but democracy chugs along, illiberal or not, because people look at the election process, they see it's free and fair. But what are you doing about minority rights? What are you doing about the principles of inalienable human rights, as it were, which are enshrined in the Constitution? And you spoke about foreign policy. I think it's a question of us versus them. You create this other that you need to somehow consolidate public support against. And I think you see that happening in the foreign policy of many of the countries that are today ruled by so-called strongmen. I was just thinking, when you look at the phrase strongmen in Indian belief, I was thinking of the concept of Pahalwan and the whole...
Bahubali also.
And Bahubali.
Today there's a video out of Trump
Precisely.
looking as Bahubali.
Precisely. So this element of masculine anxiety, as it were, when it comes to, asserting your physical characteristics. And what does that do as far as women are
56
concerned?
inch ki chhati.
Exactly, yeah. So that was something that we need to keep in mind. So therefore, when it comes to foreign policy also, I think muscularity has a certain premium, and you see that being asserted when it comes to Mexicans as far as the US is concerned. They're rapists, and quote unquote, and you need to guard.
Otherize a country almost.
And you need to protect our women against them.
Well,
not their women.
Certainly sounds...
You see that where the Rohingya are concerned in Myanmar.
Absolutely.
So it's this whole concept of how threat is being defined and how you deal with that threat. And you need to consolidate public support around the actions you need to take against that threat.
Very interesting. And one of the first thoughts over here, and I'll come to you, Maria, is what Ambassador Rao said, which is that a democracy actually remains a democracy. And nobody is undemocratic until they actually do away with the tools of democracy. Many have thought that it was the Arab Spring that became the big moment in the last decade that led to this democratic moment across the world. In fact, many of the people who came to power due to the Arab Spring were very illiberal people. I want to ask you very specifically, what is the role of the media in all of this? We saw during the Arab Spring, for example, that the fact that there were television cameras out there showing even at Tahrir Square is not as many people, if you were actually there, as perhaps televisions are able to show. A television can make it look like the entire world is out in a sea of humanity in different parts of the world against a person, or they can make a crowd look fairly ordinary and not so large after all. Any thoughts on the specific role of the media in propagating this age of strongman?
Yes, I think that one of the first things that we tend to see whenever there's a person with autocratic tendencies who is then democratically elected is going after the media. One of the ways is either you start threatening advertisers or you start intimidating the journalists themselves. So what we saw in the Arab Spring was in Syria, the media was still largely controlled by Assad. So what did Syrians do? They created their own media, rebel media, I can't remember some of the names, but there were some very interesting names that came out from different activist or rebel groups in different provinces throughout Syria. What we also saw, like in Yemen, for instance, was the rise of newspapers, more traditional forms of media, because their strongman or their autocratic leader, Saleh, had been thrown out, and they were able to really kind of beef up their newspapers in a way that they had never been able to report properly or freely before. So what we see when these leaders tend to be elected or chosen or take power is the neutering, for lack of a better word, of the free media. So we saw that in Egypt. Right now there's many journalists in Egypt who are in jail. Turkey, for instance, Turkey's a democracy, but Turkey also has the largest number of journalists in prison, even in comparison to Iran or to China.
If I remember correctly, the army actually went in and took over its largest newspaper and just moved the journalists out, and from the next day there was a new staff at the newspaper.
Yeah, what did we see in Sri Lanka in 2018 when there was the kind of coup well, it was a coup, or an attempted coup, was the first thing that those that were allied to the Rajapaksa did was storm the national state broadcaster. And what we're seeing in India, and I'm not saying that the present government is autocratic, they were democratically elected, but what is concerning for many activists is that journalists feel like they cannot report openly and freely here. And I have had many local journalists come up to me, and I'm sure Max has gotten this as well, and say, thank you, because we feel like we can't completely tell the full side of things. And actually, I'd just like to take the moment to say that I'm a huge fan of The Hindu, and I read it every single morning, and I'm just amazed that this paper comes out every single day and is in my hands. So I just want to say that.
Well, thank you. That's the good point to move to Mr. Ravi, who's responsible for so much of the journalism at The Hindu. Interestingly, Maria talks about the role of strongmen and how they actually try to take over the media, even as the media is playing a huge part in sort of promoting them in a sense, of putting these images out, of building the myth that surrounds a lot of the strongmen in so many of these countries. Some would say, okay, so this is a problem because democracy has begun to mean majority rules and not representation for all. But others would just say, this is simply democracy in action. Some will come in, somebody will go out. Do you think it is illiberal, in fact, to suggest that there's a problem with strongmen?
Thank you, Suhasini. I've been reading a very interesting and instructive book by two Harvard professors, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, titled How Democracies Die. It's not quite 1984, but still, it gives us enough food for thought. And it presents a picture that's eerily similar to what we see in India and many other parts of the world right now. They describe how in the first stage, a leader with extreme views, gains the nomination of a political party, contests elections as a demagogue, plays upon fears of the people, plays upon disaffection, loss of jobs, and their economic condition, plays upon fears of the other, which could be either the enemy within or the enemy without, and so on, and gains office. And after he gains office, the pattern they found is very similar across the world, that they get impatient with the normal restraints, constitutional restraints of a liberal democracy, and then try to influence the courts, tries to turn the constitutional institutions into weapons against their opponents politically within the country, and how they bribe or threaten the media into submission, and the private sector as well is co-opted into their process. And in the whole process, a non-level playing field is created against opponents. In fact, many of the leading players of the opposition are charged or jailed and so on, not that the opposition would clean. They have vulnerabilities in terms of corruption, in terms of other offenses and so on. But the point is that the investigative agencies, the tax agencies are used against the opposition more than against the supporters of the government. They are spared. And so this non-level playing field is created. Again, in terms of policies, a strong man would probably get impatient with long-held policies, long-held viewpoints, and try to overturn them despite opposition from within the bureaucracy, within the establishment. You saw that in the case of in economics, in the case of the demonetization, where virtually every economist of any standing would have not recommended demonetization at all. Then in the case of the virtual abrogation of Article 370, where there's been a long-held policy to possibly try to slowly dilute it but not abrogate it, and the CAA, which linked citizenship to religion. So these laws, the impatience with not just institutions but also with long-held views and policies. That's because the constitutional checks on a government or the institutions of democracy work only to a certain extent. Beyond that, you need democratic norms, namely toleration or recognition of opposition as equally legitimate. And again, the forbearance or restraint in using the instruments of power when you occupy office temporarily, to use them against your opponent to create a non-level playing field. Unless these two essential conditions are also met, along with the normal constitutional checks, it won't be possible to stem the erosion of democracy.
That's an interesting point. Ambassador Rao spoke about the otherization of countries, which becomes the foreign policy. But internally, too, what you're doing is you're otherizing the opposition. And of course, there are many examples in India, but I thought I'd pick up a few examples of that around the world. US President Trump called the Ukrainian president, and this is, of course, amongst other things, this one has been proven, and discussed how they could help him in information against the Democrats. In Poland and in Hungary, the opposition is called Not Real Poles, or Not Real Hungarians in Hungary. Turkish President Recep Erdogan once said in Parliament, "We are the people. Who are you?" So the essential thing is there's an exclusive right to rule because you have been elected democratically by 30% or 33% or 51% or whatever it is. But it's an exclusive right to rule over all. In that sense, Ambassador Rao, if I could ask you, are we moving in these age of strongmen towards what is essentially a one-party system of the kind you have yourself seen? You were ambassador in China. And seeing the growth of leaders who resemble some of these countries that have only one party?
Well, I think, as you said, what these strongmen or quasi-authoritarian leaders are trying to do is create that otherization, as I mentioned earlier, and also to create this fear among the people, the majority, and that's where the tyranny of the majority really comes in. This kind of affirmative action for the majority, not affirmative action for a minority, but for a majority, which is portrayed and which is interpreted as having been somehow shortchanged by history. And therefore you see the mythification of history also. And you see the mythification of what happened in the past, the vilification of leadership that perhaps was pioneering as far as the creation of the Republic was concerned. I will not take names here, but you can understand where I'm headed. And I was very intrigued by what is happening in Turkey too. And we had a Turkish woman journalist authored a book called The 7 Steps to Dictatorship. In our country, the 7 steps, we all know, like the Saptapadi, but I don't want to sound blasphemous in any way, but certainly the 7 steps to a dictatorship, you asked me, was first establish a movement. You establish a movement, a popular movement, which is what populism is about. Secondly, you choose your own truth. You choose your own truth. Thirdly, you lie, you lie, you lie. Fourthly, you let the people laugh, mainly the men laugh, because, President Erdogan, for instance, there was something from Turkey, or one of the Islamists, not perhaps Mr. Erdogan, one of the Islamists saying that women should not laugh loud in public. They should not be seen as laughing out loud. And that led to a lot of Twitter hashtags and social media.
Well, we have many here who think women should not, wear something.
Yeah.
Or easy,
So even women laughing becomes an object of criticism. Then you fifthly design the perfect citizen. You design the perfect citizen. You define and give your own definition of what a perfect citizen would be. And then you neuter established systems. You sort of kind of make them ineffective. And finally, you design your own country. So
those are the 7 steps. Very well put, and thank you for sharing that with us. Max Rodenbeck, so we're seeing this pattern develop. You had in the beginning said something about the fact that many of these strongmen emerge because they walk into a vacuum. They walk into a vacuum of ideology or of morality, or there's a very corrupt regime, or there is a backlash. In a sense, many have said there's a backlash to globalization, to economic policies. It is interesting that the US saw its first non-white president to be replaced by somebody who couldn't be more white, if that's not a racist term. We in India had our first minority prime minister, followed by an extremely majoritarian prime minister who has held certain beliefs in that regard. So is there a sense of a backlash that essentially there have been, and this is something that those who oppose these strongmen must recognize, that there is not just a sense of anger, but there is a sense of complete pushback against something that was seen as
Absolutely. I think if you look at any of these guys, and I would start with Berlusconi in Italy, who may be the first of this kind of example of the new democratic populists, who came into power in the 1990s. 1994, he was the longest serving prime minister in Italy, served for 9 years. But he stepped into a situation where Italian politics was in meltdown. The sort of polarization between right and left had collapsed. The Communist Party, which was always one of the poles, had collapsed. People were totally fed up with the entire political class. There was corruption everywhere. And here was this crass guy with fancy, loud suits, who was also a billionaire, who marches onto the stage. And he was sort of irresistible as a spectacle, but it had to do with how disappointed people were with what had gone before. Same thing in Turkey with Erdogan, for example. Turkey had put up with decades and decades of rather creepy military rule with a facade of civilian leaders who were corrupt and basically toys of the military, but played this game and sort of kept repeating themselves. And Erdogan comes in as someone new and fresh and different, who's going to both fight the military and also represent the sort of suppressed religious side. So Turkey had also put up with this kind of enforced secularism that had gotten large swathes of the Turkish public very annoyed. So he came in as a sort of clean sweep type of person. Putin is another great example. He arrived in power after the decade of total turbulence under Yeltsin, when the whole country seemed to be falling apart. Russians felt embarrassed in front of the world at what their country had turned into. Their economy was a mess and so on. And so here was this sort of straight, tough guy from the old school of the KGB, just the answer we need to the situation that we're in. So I think those kinds of conditions have been crucial. And the same could be said of the US, as you say. It's not so much because of Obama. I think it's or to some people, certainly to American racists, Obama was a disturbing thing. But I think, behind Trump and the damage that he's done to the American polity, there was a growing sense of dysfunction anyway, that it was quite irrespective of Trump. There is an extreme dysfunction in America. Same thing with Boris Johnson, too. Total dismay with the ruling class. Boris Johnson makes people laugh, So wouldn't you rather watch him on TV than the other guy? It's quite simple, That could have been predicted, miles off. So absolutely, I think the conditions are vital.
Of where the opposition just collapses in a sense and is unable to find a counter. In fact, these studies have found that when you exchange right-wing populism, or as in you push out a right-wing populist leader in a free and fair election, and you bring in left-wing populism, that actually degrades democracy further. It doesn't in a sense, bring back the center. So I want to turn now to what is the way forward? Because as I said, is this going to be the alpha century or just the alpha decade? Are people going to start voting strongmen out? We've seen it certainly in Austria, in Italy as well. But then we see other leaders in the Philippines and all those countries in Europe that I mentioned, so many countries now in South America. So back to that study that said that of the strongmen that were looked at over a 30-year period, but remember that most of those are from the last 15 years, 17% actually stepped down after free and fair elections that voted them out. 17% hit term limits and therefore stepped down. So 34%, one-third, pretty healthy, of such strongmen actually moved out very gracefully. 23% were forced out by impeachment or just forced out. And 30% are still in power. In fact, they found that while the average age of a ordinary democratic leader in power is about 3 years, the average age of the populist leader is 6.5 years, and they almost always get re-elected, at least for the second time. Would you say strongmen are just here to stay?
No, I don't think strongmen are here to stay. I think that that's because at the end of the day, we believe in systems because a system is much greater than the sum of its parts. Systems have checks in place. Systems don't fail people as much as people fail people. No matter how charismatic or brilliant a leader is, unfortunately, if they have autocratic tendencies, they tend to just listen to a handful of people. Maybe it's one, maybe it's five. But what they like is yes men or yes women, and those don't tend to lead to good policies. And what we're seeing right now in places where there have been democracies, let's say in Lebanon or in Iraq, is what we're seeing is they're saying, okay, you know what, enough. We've had, it's a bit of a different situation. They're not based on strongmen, but what you have is people saying, okay, we're sick of like the references to 500 years ago, or we're sick of you shoving the Bible down our throat, or the Quran down our throat, or whatever religious book down our throat. At the end of the day, what is your plan for tomorrow? Because we're sick of looking back at how aggrieved our ancestors were. Okay, I don't know my great-great-grandfather who might have been, I don't know, whose wife maybe was bundled away by some, mogul, 200 years ago or whatever it is. We want to look forward, and unfortunately, economies are cyclical. So a lot of times these strong men cannot always deliver. And so what we'll see eventually is that people will say, we've had enough, and you don't have a plan, and the cult of personality is not bringing food on my plate. So what's your plan?
So you're saying there'll be a backlash to the backlash?
Eventually.
Mr. Ravi, in fact, Maria spoke about the grievance, the sense of grievance that people tire of. In fact, it is, according to many studies, the thing that populists most look for is not the majority vote. They don't look to be voted in by the entire majority. They look for the minority within a majority that feels a sense of grievance. That grievance can be historical, it can be cultural, it can be social. It's a sense that they have not been able to get their due despite being larger numbers. Into this is built the treatment of the minorities. Do you think that is one of the troubling aspects, perhaps?
Actually, the strong leader plays not just upon the sense of grievance, but also on popular admiration for strong leadership. Because a strong leader always has an advantage, even in an electoral contest, over the colorless one. So the strong leader uses his image as a strong leader to gain power. And then having gained power through addressing the fears of the majority, might want to go ahead and implement policies despite constitutional safeguards that affect the rights of minorities. I think the route through electoral politics to gain power and by playing upon the fears of the majority and then targeting the minority is a normal trend.
All right. Ambassador Rao, can I put that question on the strong men versus strong women? Because somebody did point out to me once when I was making this long case about the age of strong men, that we have seen very strong women leaders in the past. We've seen Indira Gandhi, Golda Meir, Prime Minister Bandaranaike as well, Benazir Bhutto, Margaret Thatcher, Sheikh Hasina today. In a sense, do you think that the strong women should be categorized along with the strong men? Do you think they're different?
That's a difficult question. In today's day and age, I think the emphasis is on strong and perhaps not so much on men versus women when it comes to who's elected to lead a democracy. But I think beyond that, I think what women can bring to the public space is very different from what strong men can bring to the public space. And unfortunately, perhaps women have not been able, but even beyond that, when I think of the record of Indira Gandhi, for instance, I think she combined both those powers of strength with very deep femininity also. And that femininity was expressed, I think, in many ways in her treatment of people. And in the fact that ultimately she had to uphold after the nightmare of the emergency, she had to really go back to upholding the values of the Constitution. So, but the fact is that when she was able to achieve the liberation of Bangladesh, in Parliament, you had people, even the opposition leaders like Mr. Vajpayee, refer to her as Mahishasura Mardini. So the image of the strong women is very, very entrenched in our own mythology and in our own, principles and beliefs. So it's easy, perhaps, to embrace the idea of a strong woman, too, from that point of view. But I think what we need to do and really emphasize today is, in an era of strong men and in an era where a leading democracy like the United States, which has so many checks and balances when it comes to upholding the power of the minorities. If you look at the way the Constitution plays out, the way their political structures are, the independent judiciary, the Senate, for instance. You have 50 states in the United States, but every state, regardless of their population, brings only 2 members to the Senate. So an Arizona with 3.7 million people and a California with 30 million people has the same representation in the Senate. And you have local governments, you have state governments, you have business, private business, you have the NGOs, you have the media. So in a sense, because I think ultimately you cannot appeal to the angels in us, because we are not angels, you have to create checks and balances in a democracy.
All right. So I just want to go around very quickly and ask each of you exactly the same question, which is, if this populism is a problem in as much as it leads to certain things people don't like. Obviously, everybody loves decisive leadership. Everybody loves somebody who brings back national pride. Why wouldn't they? But then there are the downsides, the treatment of the opposition or the minorities or the media, or the otherization of other countries and other races, religions, and all of that. So I want to just go around very quickly and say, what is the balance to this populism? What is the best balance to this kind of populism, Max?
Well, I think the best balance is strong institutions, which cannot be guaranteed. I mean, it's something that people have to work on continuously, all the time. And of course, one of the attributes of populist leaders is that they do try to subvert and undermine or bypass institutions. So certainly strong institutions are the vital thing. Yeah.
That's a good one. In fact, this Princeton professor who wrote the book, What is Populism, actually said, a populist leader has crossed the pale, if you like, when they do two things. One is either build a new city, or the other was change the constitution. Maria, what's the best balance?
Maybe it's because I'm a journalist and I love media so much, but I have to say it's probably the media, whether it's a citizen journalist or a reporter like yourself. At the end of the day, and I think that this is, with all of the ills that Twitter and Facebook have brought to us, there's a lot of good. Information is no longer something that you can control. Information is like water. If you try to hold it, it will always find seepages in the cracks of your hands and come out. And that's probably the reason why when a democratically elected leader decides to go a little bit autocratic or full-blown autocratic, first thing they do is intimidate the media. And that's because they don't like any opposition.
So a good, strong balance is from the media? Yes.
Well, I think I just take a cue from what Mr. Ravi said. From our leaders, I think we should expect more toleration and forbearance. And I think as the people, I think we should always seek accountability, we should seek justice, and we should seek dignity.
So values, in a sense, are the best balance, and the upholding of those values. Mr. Ravi?
Actually, apart from the institutions of democracy, which can be subverted almost unnoticeably, the unwritten rules of democracy, the norms of democracy have to be followed. And apart from that, the second safeguard probably in India would be the diversity among all the states, with different political parties ruling and so on, so that the writ of no political party runs across the country.
All right. So we have four, if you like, balances, solutions to the kind of situation we see around the world. I'd like to open this up for questions, if I may. And we have a lot of questions. Sir, may I come to you in just a bit? And then there are a few in the back that I wanted to try and get to.